Hi there. So today I'm going to be stepping you through how to set up the depth system that you see right here. And by depth system, I mean creating this effect that you see in a lot of 2D games, where even though we're confined to 2D, we create the illusion of depth by moving behind objects. So in this tutorial, I'm going to assume you already have a basic project set up, just like I do here. So you've got some objects, some sprites for those objects, some basic movement in your player objects, and you pop them all into a room. Maybe you've got some tiles if you're really fancy. And if you've gotten that far into your game, I'm also assuming you have a basic knowledge of GameMaker, you know what object events are, you know a bit of coding. So the system we're going to be setting up, it's not too complicated, and I'm going to be walking you through every step. So it should be understandable even if you're relatively new. All right, let's get started. So before we start coding, I just want to walk you through the logic of our system. And to start off with, I want us to just have a think about what GameMaker is doing by default. So right here is my game without any depth system present. I just dragged a bunch of objects into my room and added some movement for the player and an NPC, but there's no depth ordering. So now, why do some objects appear behind others? What is it that's determining this? And the answer is to do with the draw event. So remember, all object instances have their own draw event, and every frame of the game, every instance is called upon to perform its draw event, where it just draws its sprite onto the screen. So let's walk through one of these frames. So pretend this is our room at the start of the frame. It's just an empty blank canvas, no objects have been drawn yet. The first instance draws itself onto the screen, and we can imagine this kind of like sticking a sticker onto the blank canvas. All right, and now the second object draws itself to the screen, and then the third, and then the fourth. So you can see they're all drawing on top of each other, and the later your draw event is, the further in front you're going to appear. So it's the draw order that's causing this effect that we see. The thing determining which objects are in front of others is just where they are in that drawing queue. So okay, but what determines that queue order? Which objects get to be drawn first? That's just the order that you drag them into the room. So in my project, the first object that I dragged in was my player object, Susan. And consequently, her draw event goes first, and she appears behind every other object in the room. So now this isn't a great system for us. It doesn't create the effect we want. What we want is objects that are higher up to be drawn behind objects that are beneath it. So we want a system based off of the object's Y position in the room. So I've written some code that shows you every object's Y position in the room and the origin of that object. And so I just want to take this moment to point out that all my objects, all of their sprites, their origin is centered at the bottom in the center. So if you're going to be following along, you have to make sure that all your objects' origin points in their sprites is consistent. So all of them are at the bottom center, or all of them at the top center, or in the middle center, but they just have to be consistent, because that's where we want to determine their position. Anyway, so we can see that the higher up an object is, the smaller its Y value is. And that's because in GameMaker, the Y equals 0 point, the Y origin is up the top. And then the further down we go, the larger our Y value is. So what we're going to do is create a depth system that gets all the objects' Y positions and sorts them so that objects that have the smallest Y are going to be drawn first, and they're going to appear behind every other object. So to do this, we basically have to get rid of the default system. We're actually going to get the objects to stop drawing themselves, and instead we're going to have a master object draw them in order of their Y value. To do this, we're going to set up a grid that looks like this. It's going to have two columns. So the first one is going to store a list of all the instances, all their unique IDs, and in the second column, we're going to store all of their corresponding Y values. So to get this grid, we're going to get all of our instances to run a script which adds themselves and their Y position to the grid. And then we're going to sort this grid by the Y values, so that it's sorted in ascending order so that the lowest Y value is up the top. And then we're going to get that master object to draw all of these instances one by one with the lowest Y value instance going first. So where are we going to be storing our data? What can we use in GameMaker that's like a grid? Well, we're going to use a DS grid. And the DS just stands for data structure. And these things are great because they come with some handy functions that we need, like DS grid sort, which is going to sort our grid column by that Y value. So the first thing we're going to do is make our master draw object. So let's create a new object, and I'm just going to call this obj draw. And all we're going to do here is come into the create event, and we're just going to make up a name for our grid. You can call this whatever you like. I'm going to call it DS for data structure and depth grid. And for now, we're just going to set it to 0. Right, so we haven't created it yet. All right, and that's all we're going to do here. So now we're going to create that script that we want all of our instances to run. And this script is going to be making the grid, and it's going to be adding all of the instances to that grid. So let's call this scr add to depth grid. Right, so let's just imagine that we're the first instance that's running the script. So we want it to be creating the depth grid. We want it to add its ID to the grid and add its Y value to the grid. So let's go and create the grid. We're going to use the function ds grid create. And so we have to give it a width and a height. So this is what it's going to look like for the first instance. We want it 2 wide and 1 high. So 2, 1. And we want to set that variable that we made, ds depth grid, equal to this grid. But remember, this ds depth grid, it doesn't belong to the calling instance. It belongs to obj draw. So we're going to have to go with obj draw and wrap all of this code in here. So now this with, so if you don't know, this with statement, it allows us to read and change the value of variables in other instances. So we kind of go into a different instance and have it run this code. Okay, so we need to add the calling instance's ID to this spot right here, and we need to add its Y position to this spot right here. So we need the coordinates of these cells. So also remember, in GameMaker, it's not going to have those helpful headings that I put here. It's just going to call it 0 and 1. So this one right here, that's actually 0, and this is 1. So the coordinate of this cell right here is x0, y0. This one here is x1 and y0. So we want the instance ID to be at 0, 0, and the y to be at 1, 0. So we're going to type ds depth grid 0, 0. So we're using this thing right here to access the value of this coordinate of our grid. We can set this cell equal to the instance ID. And so we don't just want to put self, right? Because that would be obj draw because we're in a with statement. What we want to do is come back out of the with statement and address the instance that's running the script. So to get out of this with statement, we write other. Right, and then we do the same for the y. So ds depth grid using the accessor and the x position 1, y 0. And then we want again to come out of the with statement and get the y value of the calling instance. All right, so this will do it for the first instance. So we create the grid and add ourselves to the first positions. But I don't want the next instance to be doing this. I don't want to create a new grid. So I only want to be doing this if our grid doesn't exist already. So we can check if it exists by writing ds exists. And so we have to give it an ID, the ID of our grid, which is ds depth grid. and then the type. So this is checking if a data structure exists, but remember there's lots of types of data structures. Right, so we have grids, lists, maps, queues, but ours is type grid. Right, and we're checking if it doesn't exist. So if it doesn't exist, create it. So we put this, which means doesn't. And we wrap this whole thing in this condition. Right, so that's the first one. All right, so but in every other case, there is already an instance here. So let's just say player 40 at the y value 46, and we want the next instance to come along and basically add 1 to the height of the grid. It's going to have to resize the grid to make room for itself. And then add itself to the grid. Right, so first off we resize the current grid. And then we add ourselves to the grid and we add our y value. So first we need to get the current height of the grid. And I'm going to store this in a temporary variable, height of grid. And now we need to get the height. So we're going to use the function ds_grid height, and then we give it the ID ds_depth grid. And so I just want to point something out because this can be tricky if you're just starting off with these kinds of structures. So the height of this data structure, of this grid, is 7, which means it goes from row 0 up to row 6, right? So not up to row 7, it only goes up to row 6 because we start at 0 and there's 7 rows in total, so the height is 7. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we've gotten the current height, and now we just resize the grid. So resize ds_depth grid, and then our new width, well, we want the width to stay the same, right? It's going to always be 2. But our height is going to be 1 more than the current height. So it's going to be 1 more than height of grid. So we write height of grid plus 1. All right, so now it's resized. Now let's add ourselves to the grid, and I'm just going to copy this. And we're going to have to change a value though. So what are these coordinates going to be? Well, this one is that x coordinate, right? So this one, we still want it to be 0. It's always going to be 0, right, for the instance IDs. So that's fine, but this will have to change. So what do we want this to be? So if we're just adding this one right here, we've gotten the height. So the height of the grid when it was just this size, remember, it's 1. And we want the next instance at the coordinate 0, 1. So it's going to be actually equal to height of grid. So remember, the height of grid variable, that's storing the old height, right? It's storing 1, and that's exactly the y value, the y coordinate that we need to draw the next one. So we don't put height of grid plus 1, we just put height of grid. Right, and then we do exactly the same for the y value. Dot y. And we just need to change the x value coordinate to 1. All right, and we're done with the script. That's all we need. That's going to cover all of the cases. So the first instance that creates it, and then every other instance which resizes the grid and then adds itself. So by the end, after all instances have finished running the script, we're going to have a grid that looks like this. So as you can see right now, it's all out of order. It's not sorted by the y position, so we're going to have to do this ourselves. So let's go back to obj draw, and we're going to go into the draw event. And let's just type out the logic of what we're doing. So first we want to sort the grid by y value. so that we get the lowest y values up the top, so in an ascending order. And then we want to draw all of the instances in that order. So first, I'm actually going to add a condition because I only want it to be doing any of this if the grid exists in the first place. And so that's if we have a first instance creating it. So we're going to check if ds exists, grid just like before, and the type is ds grid, right? And we'll wrap that all. All right, so let's sort the grid. Let's sort the grid now. So we're going to use the function ds grid sort, right? And so we have to give it the ID of the grid, ds depth grid. So a column to sort by, and remember that's this column, and remember, so that's column number 1. So we put 1. And now it's asking if it's in the ascending order. And so remember, ascending is sorting lowest to highest, and that's what we want. We want the lowest y values to be first. So we put true. All right, so now we want to draw all of the instances. So we're going to have to loop through that grid that we created. So we're going to be writing a for loop. Basically, I'm going to be going through the grid starting at y equals 0, and then increasing every time and drawing all of these instances one by one. So I'm going to use a for loop. So for, and the variable yy, which is going to be our y coordinate, that's going to be increasing. So we start at 0, and then we want to keep looping until y value gets to the height of our grid. So we only want to be looping while yy is less than the height of our grid. Right, and every time we loop, we want to be increasing yy by 1. All right, so all we have to do here is draw the instance. So, but first we have to get the instance. So we need access to this cell right here. So we're going to type again ds depth grid using our accessor. So 0, because this is the column that stores all the IDs, and then the y coordinate, well, that's just going to be whatever yy is, because we're looping through our grid. So 0 yy, and we want to set a variable. We want to set a variable equal to the instance ID. So we'll just call it instance ID. Right, and now we just go with that instance. Draw yourself. And that will handle everything. Doesn't matter what sprite it's on or image index or whatever. This is just the default drawing function, so it will draw itself. And so the last thing we need to do, once we're done looping through this list, drawing all the instances, we're going to destroy the grid. And on the next frame, we're going to make a totally new one. And this is really important. Okay, so in GameMaker, data structures, they're kind of different to other variables. Every time you declare a variable in GameMaker, so if I just put name Bob, every time you do this, this is stored in memory in your game when it's running. And basically, whenever you access this name and you use it maybe to draw on a sign or as part of your dialogue system or something, the game has to remember that name is equal to Bob, so it has to be stored in that memory. And basically, the more variables that you make, the more memory that your game is taking up. And if you have tons and tons and tons of variables, and your game might be running quite slowly. But usually at the end of the game, variables like this, they're deleted by GameMaker. But the thing about data structures is by default, they're actually not, and they'll just stay there so that every time you run your game, it persists in memory so that every time you're running your game, it's taking up more and more memory, and it'll get to the point basically where it will crash your game. And this is what's called a memory leak. So we need to stop this from happening. We need to make sure that we're destroying it. And just to be so this will take care of it every frame. It should be destroying itself every frame. But to be 100% super safe, if we're stopping the game halfway through a frame and it doesn't get to destroy it or something, in the unlikely event that that happens, we're just going to create a safeguard. We're going to create an event called game end. So this will run when the game ends. And we're going to destroy the grid. This is just to be safe. But I only want to destroy it if it exists in the first place, so we're going to check that it exists. So we're done. That's going to draw all of the instances. So the only thing left to do is to tell all of our objects to run that script there. And we also need to disable the default drawing system. Basically, we don't want objects drawing themselves because it is sorted by this master object. So, for example, let's go into obj Susan. By default, if you don't have a draw event set up here, it'll just be drawing itself by default. But if we make the draw event and then put nothing, this will overwrite the default and make sure it doesn't draw itself. But we do want it to be running this, we do want it to be adding itself to the depth grid. And we want it to add itself to the depth grid before the draw event happens. So during the pre-draw stage, before any objects have drawn themselves. So we're going to tell it to run the scripts. Right, and we need to do this for every single object. We need to add a draw event, make it nothing, and then in the pre-draw add this script. But let's say I'm a bit lazy and I don't want to manually do this. I can just set up a parent object and then make all of my objects that I want to be part of my depth system children of that parent. So let's do that. Let's set up obj parent depth. Right, and for its draw event, do nothing, and for its pre-draw, add itself to depth grid. Right, and let's just add all those objects as children. All right, so we're done. The only thing left to do is add obj draw to the room. And let's run the game. All right, so we are done. We have our depth system set up and it's sorting all the objects based on their Y position in the room, giving us that cool 3D effect of walking behind the objects. I will be posting a link to the project in the description if you wanted to just go through the code, or if you're having any troubles, just check that out. And yeah, that's it. Yeah, so I hope you found the video helpful. And that's it from me. I'll see you next time.